On the night of April 26th, the sky over Pripyat was torn not by flame, but by a ghostly bluish glow that made the darkness feel thick and tangible. Pieces of graphite lay on the ground, warm and smoking, resembling charred embers from a forgotten bonfire, while the air reeked of ozone and superheated metal. No one yet knew that the reactor core had already breached its containment shell, but the dosimeters clipped to the belts of the first responders began clicking with such frequency that their sound merged into a single, piercing shriek. They stared at the shattered dome, feeling invisible needles pierce their skin, understanding that the familiar world had crumbled along with the concrete slab. Inside the control rooms, dry commands were already being relayed, ordering everyone to avoid panic and continue working, as if invisible death were merely a minor technical glitch. The needles of radiation meters slammed against their red limits, yet communications officers chose silence, wiping readings with cloths and hiding instruments in pockets. Around the plant perimeter, fire crews were already assembling, their boots crunching over glass and crumbling concrete, while heavy hoses instantly soaked through with poisonous moisture. They directed streams of water into the black maw of the destroyed reactor, unaware that every liter was transforming invisible radiation into a lethal mist settling in their lungs. The wind carried a bitter taste of copper and burnt wiring across the city, making residents cough and rub their eyes, while radio waves broadcast reassuring reports about a minor incident. Street lamps trembled in the dense haze, pulling silhouettes of people from the darkness as they approached bridge railings to gaze at the fiery glow. They reached hands toward the sky, catching falling sparks that burned palms not with heat, but with instant cellular destruction. In upper-floor apartments, windows were open to let in cool air, unaware that along with the night breeze, an invisible poison drifted inside, settling on children's toys and kitchen tables. Clocks on towers displayed time that no longer mattered, while somewhere deep within the station, protective layers melted, turning steel into radioactive sludge. Shift workers rotated in complete ignorance, while leadership in protected bunkers was already drafting initial reports, carefully crossing out the word catastrophe and replacing it with phrases like localized fire. Heavy office doors slammed shut, cutting off whispers from worried engineers, while telephone lines filled with orders to maintain strict secrecy and avoid spreading panic among the population. In laboratories, instruments continued to max out, but graphs were neatly redrawn by hand, adjusted to match safe standards approved decades earlier. The machinery of the state apparatus kicked into full gear, grinding truth into harmless reports, while the city slowly poisoned itself with its own calm. Morning brought no relief, only thickening the gray veil that obscured building outlines and turned familiar streets into a labyrinth of ghosts. People walked sidewalks in everyday clothing, unaware of radioactive dust settling on coat collars and weaving into their hair. Children boarded school buses, laughing and noticing a strange metallic taste in their mouths, which adults called morning freshness. In directors' offices and factory workshops, calls to maintain labor discipline were already ringing out, while in hospitals, doctors anxiously examined the first burns on patients' skin, attributing them to household chemicals. Behind closed party committee doors, the fate of thousands of lives was already being decided, but not for salvation, rather for preserving reputation and control over the territory. Archive safes received authentic measurements that vanished forever from public records, replaced by neatly rewritten tables with fabricated numbers. Every step on asphalt became part of an invisible ritual of denial, where fear of punishment outweighed the instinct for self-preservation. The city continued to breathe, unaware that the air had already become an enemy, and the silence over the station was merely an ominous precursor to the storm yet to come. Morning brought not dawn, but a heavy yellowish haze that settled on kindergarten windowsills and school desks. The air felt thick, as if infused with molten glass, and every breath left a taste of oxidized copper and ash on the tongue. Sunlight pierced through the murky veil, painting streets in a sickly amber hue that made shadows stretch long and unnaturally black. On the asphalt, traces of morning dew remained, but the moisture no longer brought freshness. It only spread invisible particles across concrete and grass. The city awakened in its usual rhythm, unaware that the sky above had transformed into a dome of silent threat. Children drew suns with crayons, not noticing how gray ash clung to their palms and wove itself into the folds of their clothing. Caregivers wiped tables with damp cloths, but stains returned again, as if matter itself resisted purification. A strange odor hung in the air, reminiscent of burning rubber mixed with damp earth, yet no one asked questions. Children laughed, launching paper airplanes that immediately grew heavy from settling dust and fell to the floor. In that moment, silence in the rooms felt absolute, though somewhere in the distance, ventilation systems already hummed, grinding poisoned air and returning it back into the spaces. Adults in white coats silently wiped instruments with alcohol, their displays showing off-the-charts readings, and their hand movements grew increasingly mechanical. Dosimeter needles trembled at maximum marks, but fingers quickly pressed them down, forcing silence under threat of reprimand. Hallways and medical facilities smelled of iodine and bleach, yet this scent could no longer mask the sweetish hint of decay penetrating through ventilation. Lab technicians recorded results in journals, then crossed them out with black pens and wrote new, safe values. Each crossed-out stroke became a small act of betrayal, but fear of consequences proved stronger than conscience. In executives' offices, reports for the Capitol were already being drafted, where radiation levels were called safe and alarming readings were attributed to equipment error. Telephone lines crackled with tense negotiations, but only polished phrases about localized malfunctions and routine inspections aired publicly. Maps with red markers indicating contamination zones lay on desks, but they were quickly hidden in drawers, replaced by clean forms with green stamps. Officials signed documents not with ink, but with confidence in their own infallibility, ignoring trembling fingers and cold sweat on foreheads. The bureaucratic machine operated flawlessly, grinding reality into report-friendly formats. In hospital wards, strands of hair remained on pillows, skin covered with dark spots resembling burns from invisible fire. Patients tossed in half-sleep, feeling internal organs constrict with spasms, breathing becoming heavy and irregular. Nurses changed sheets, trying not to meet the eyes of those who already understood that treatment brought no relief. In room corners, silence accumulated, broken only by quiet coughing and the creak of beds. Outside windows, clouds drifted like cotton scraps, but their beauty only emphasized the hopelessness unfolding within four walls. Medical staff continued smiling and speaking of mild colds, though their eyes betrayed muted despair. They prescribed vitamins and sedatives, knowing these measures only delayed the inevitable. Prescription forms bore strange annotations that later vanished from archives, yielding to standard recommendations. Laboratory analyses returned marked urgent, but were immediately filed in folders stamped confidential. Every step by personnel became part of an unspoken ritual of concealment, where truth was sacrificed to systemic stability. Hospital walls absorbed moans but emitted no sound. The city lived in a ghostly rhythm, where every breath became a slow step into abyss, and silence from above grew thicker than poisonous fog over the river. Cars crawled slowly through streets, leaving trails of exhaust that mixed with radioactive dust. Store windows reflected distorted faces of passers-by hurrying about their business, unaware of invisible threat. Playgrounds emptied by midday, though earlier they had teemed with laughter and running. Now only swings creaked softly in the wind, swaying without riders, like a monument to suddenly interrupted childhood. At markets, vendors displayed vegetables and fruits, not noticing how their skins became coated with microscopic film. Shoppers carefully selected produce, setting aside items that seemed too soft or dull. Cash register receipts showed numbers, but they no longer mattered when the count was internal radiation exposure. Trucks distributed goods to regions, carrying not only food, but also invisible cargo. Roads led nowhere, transforming into arteries through which a quiet epidemic of denial spread. In schools, teachers explained lessons in monotone voices, try not to notice coughing in back rows. Blackboards filled with chalk, but lime particles mixed with settling dust, creating strange texture on surfaces. Students copied notebooks, not noticing how their hands trembled from unexplained weakness. Schedules listed physical education classes, but gymnasiums stood empty, sneakers gathering dust in lockers. Administration circulated memos about hygiene compliance, though hand-washing could no longer wash away what penetrated through skin. At factories, workers started machines, feeling metallic taste in mouths become a constant companion. Conveyor belts moved at familiar speeds, but parts failed quality checks more often than norms allowed. Supervisors conducted unscheduled inspections, documenting corrosion on surfaces that appeared too quickly. Workshops hummed with noise drowning whispers of doubt, while alarm signals were disabled under pretext of false triggers. Every mechanism operated at its limit, but where it came not from load, but from invisible molecular-level destruction. In apartments, housewives wiped dust, but it returned faster than cloths could dry. Curtains yellowed at windows, though laundered every few days. Air in rooms felt stuffy despite open windows admitting the same fog. Children complained of headaches, but parents attributed it to fatigue or weather changes. Shelves held canned goods whose lids already showed rust, though expiration dates had barely begun. Domestic comfort transformed into a trap, where every surface held particles of invisible storm. In institutional archives, invisible work intensified as documents were rewritten, filed, and marked with new stamps. Secretaries sorted folders by color, separating alarming reports from approved instructions. Inkwells dried, but ink still left traces on paper, creating a history that never was. In basements, copies of original measurements were stored, but access was blocked by heavy grates and coded locks. Every sheet became testimony to silent collusion, where truth was sacrificed to order. On streets, patrol cars with flashing lights moved about, but their beams did not dispel darkness. They only emphasized its density. Drivers detoured around puddles, though water in them had long ceased to be transparent. Streetlights flickered intermittently, creating a stop-motion film effect, where each frame concealed the next. Passers-by lowered their gazes, avoiding eye contact with neighbors whose looks might reveal too much. Silence between buildings thickened, turning neighborhoods into labyrinths of invisible barriers. In parks, trees began losing foliage ahead of schedule, though calendars indicated early summer. Wind rustled fallen leaves that curled into tubes and darkened before one's eyes. Benches stood empty, covered with sticky resin emitting strange aroma. Squirrels and birds vanished from sight, yielding to nature's heavy silence. Environmental services conducted measurements, but their instruments were immediately disabled under pretext of calibration. Greenery withered not from drought, but from invisible poison penetrating roots. In polyclinics, reception areas filled with people, but queues moved slowly, as if time itself had slowed. Doctors examined patients, documenting symptoms that did not fit known diagnoses. Blood was drawn for analysis, but results were delayed under pretext of technical issues. Hallways smelled of medicine and anxiety, blending into a heavy atmosphere of waiting. Every step on linoleum left a footprint, but no one considered where this path led. At emergency stations, dispatchers took calls, recording addresses on forms marked priority. Vehicles departed with sirens, but routes changed according to unspoken directives. In garages, equipment was inspected, sensors replaced with older models giving artificially low readings. Mechanics worked in gloves, but dust penetrated fabric, settling on skin. Every trip became a journey into unknown, where maps no longer matched territory. In cultural centers, performances were canceled, replaced by safety briefings. Posters were removed from walls, leaving traces of glue and faded paper. Auditoriums stood empty, those seats still held impressions of recent visitors. On stages, spotlights were dimmed, plunging spaces into semi-darkness where echoes of footsteps sounded especially clear. Culture retreated into shadow, yielding to dry statistics and instruction. In stores, shelves gradually emptied, though deliveries continued on schedule. Cashiers counted change, but coins felt colder than usual. Shoppers hurried, not lingering at displays where goods lost their appeal. In refrigerators, compressors hummed, trying to maintain temperature, but products spoiled faster. Commerce transformed into ritual exchange, where value was measured not in money, but in ability to avoid invisible threat. In educational institutions, directors held meetings discussing summer camp plans. Documents were signed without discussion, though appendices listed high-risk zones. Teachers prepared materials, but texts were edited before printing. In classrooms, posters with health slogans hung, though air already carried opposite message. Education continued functioning, adapting to new reality without official announcements. Over the city hung a heavy silence that could not be measured by instruments, but was felt by everyone. Sky remained pale, concealing true scale of events behind veil of fog. People continued living, but their movements grew more cautious, gazes more grounded. Wind carried fragments of news, but they drowned in sea of official calm. The city breathed, but every breath brought closer the moment when silence would become unbearable. Men climbed on his scorching rooftops wearing lead aprons and rubber coats, feeling heavy air press against their chests while shovels slid over glowing debris. Staircase steps trembled under heavy boots, each stride measuring not distance but remaining time. The air smelled of burnt material and ozone, mixing with sharp metallic taste that settled on lips and embedded itself into skin. They did not speak because words drowned in ventilation hum and dry crackling of radiation piercing space with merciless whisper. Lead plates dug into shoulders creating unbearable pressure, yet no one complained about pain. Physical weight of protection felt insignificant compared to invisible burden already penetrating cells. Rubber coats rustled with every movement, reminding of surgical halls where shovels replaced scalpels and destroyed structures replaced patients. Graphite blocks lay on concrete, warm and ominous, like charred hearts of giant mechanism that had stopped only for a moment. Every second above measured life, and they swept radioactive waste into steel maws of machines, knowing their bodies had already absorbed doses capable of melting bones. Belt-mounted dosimeters chattered without cease, merging in a single rhythm of counted moments. Dust rose in columns, settling on protective goggles and working into glove seams, yet hands continued working with mechanical precision. Wind carried particles away only to return them, swirling into invisible funnels where time lost its familiar course. Below, banners and holiday columns were being prepared, while children rehearsed steps on asphalt that still held traces of poisonous dust. Musical orchestras tuned instruments, extracting lively marches whose notes shattered against heavy atmosphere of foreboding. Flags waved above tribunes, bright and carefree, hiding from passers by the gray veil hanging over industrial buildings. Smiles on organizers' faces appeared like frozen masks, concealing muted tension and awareness of inevitable. Leaders circled tribunes' checking order, while archives stored sheets with real measurements in safes, replacing them with forged certificates. Stamps slapped paper with dull sound, approving falsehood as only permissible truth. Telephones crackled with short commands demanding maintenance of calm appearance and prevention of panic among residents. Offices held sterile silence, broken only by pens scratching and rustling of destroyed originals whose numbers could overturn everything. Contrast between victims on rooftops and smiling faces in squares became unbearable. Yet suppression machine worked flawlessly, transforming catastrophe into scheduled event. Loudspeakers broadcast calls for vigilance, while simultaneously forbidding any discussion about incident. People marched in columns, not noticing how their shadows stretched in wrong light cast by emergency spotlights. System demanded obedience, and every participant unwittingly became cog in denial mechanism. Shovels struck heated concrete, sparking flames that instantly extinguished in thick air. Hands ached from unfamiliar heaviness, but muscles continued contracting, obeying trained body memory. Sweat streamed down faces, mixing with dust, forming dirty streaks on cheeks, yet no one raised hands to faces fearing breach of protective ceiling. Breathing became irregular, while ringing grew in ears resembling distant siren wail, warning of end times. Graphite crumbled under metal edges, scattering into black fragments, glowing with dull, sickly radiance. This was not magic, merely physics of decay, manifesting in visible form accessible to naked eye. Each discarded piece flew into open hatch, disappearing into reactor depths, but invisible particles remained suspended in space, penetrating through fabric and skin. Air felt like thick syrup, slowing movements and forcing hearts to beat in ragged rhythm. Geiger counters choked on continuous crackle, yet their readings were ignored like annoying noise impossible to habituate to. Shift commanders checked watches, measuring permissible minutes in contamination zones, knowing every extra second brought bodies closer to point of no return. Eyes watered from strain, but gazes remained fixed forward, focusing on next pile of debris. Silence between people weighed heavier than lead, filled with understanding that return to former life would not happen. Below, detachments marched their boots, striking asphalt in perfect rhythm, drowning quiet moans of city. Red banners waved above heads, creating illusion of celebration unclouded by anxiety. Conductors waved batons, extracting loud chord from brass instruments that reflected off glass facades, returning as echo resembling warning. People applauded, not noticing how palms covered with thin layer of invisible dust settled overnight. Event organizers checked lists, crossing out names of those who failed to appear at rehearsal without asking about reasons for absence. Absence attributed to colds or fatigue, convenient explanations requiring no additional verification. Archives already formed reports about favorable conditions where words accident and irradiation replaced with euphemisms about technical difficulties. Paper absorbed ink, creating history convenient for morning newspaper printing and radio reading. Sirens remained silent, though their masts towered over neighborhoods, ready at any moment to tear silence with piercing wail. Instead, broadcasts called for order and discipline, reminding of importance of collective unity facing trials. Streets decorated with garlands, hiding cracked plaster and traces of hasty cleanup conducted during night hours. Store windows reflected passersby whose faces appeared pale and tense despite accepted smiles. On rooftops, time flowed differently, stretching into endless moments where every gesture required conscious effort. Shovels became extensions of hands, and hands became tools deprived of right to fatigue. Air heated from hot surfaces, creating mirages where ruins transformed into silhouettes of long-forgotten buildings. People moved through these illusions, orienting by command sounds and metal creaks, replacing visual landmarks in dense haze. Radiation doses accumulated, invisibly penetrating blood and settling in bones, where they began slow work of internal destruction. Skin reddened, covering with small spots resembling burns from invisible flame, but pain arrived later, delayed for hours and days. Now existed only rhythm, only work, only necessity to complete task before clock hand crossed fateful line. Thoughts cleared of excess, leaving only concentration on next shovel movement. In archive storage, invisible work intensified as original measurements vanished in furnace flames or dissolved in special solutions. Secretaries rewrote numbers, adjusting them to standards approved decades earlier, when such threat scales were not even suspected. Stamps applied with confidence, approving falsehood as law, while signatures sealed documents, becoming shields for those giving orders from above. Every sheet became brick in denial wall. Leaders descended from tribunes, checking camera and microphone placement that were to broadcast celebration across entire country. Their faces remained impenetrable, hiding inner tremor and understanding of error scale committed during night hours. Pockets held notes, instructing not to mention incident in broadcasts, replacing alarming news with reports about labor achievements. Cameras adjusted, focusing on smiling faces and waving flags, ignoring horizon. Contrast grew each minute, transforming into invisible chasm, separating those sacrificing themselves from those continuing to live in illusion. March sounds reached rooftops, mixing with equipment hum, creating dissonance that tightened muscles. People above felt this rupture, but continued working, knowing their silence part of deal concluded without their consent. Below, applause sounded louder, drowning wind whisper, carrying destruction particles. Suppression machine worked flawlessly, transforming catastrophe into scheduled event where every element calculated to smallest detail. Instructions distributed through communication channels, demanding calm, maintenance, and resistance to rumors circulating in entryways and kitchens. People nodded, accepting official assurances as truth, because alternative required courage lacking in daily routine. Fear of unknown proved stronger than self-preservation instinct. Shovels continued scraping concrete, removing remnants of what yesterday had been energy system heart, and today became source of invisible death. Hands ached, but movements did not slow, obeying internal rhythm, replacing commands. Darkened goggles hid eyes, where fatigue, already readable, had no relation to physical labor. This was soul fatigue, accepting burden impossible to shed, only carry until end of allotted time. Below, children laughed, launching balloons into air that slowly rose, carrying fragments of childish laughter. Air currents caught light spheres, carrying them toward industrial zone, where they burst before reaching destination. No one noticed this detail, absorbed by rehearsals and costume checks, creating celebration atmosphere. Flags swayed to music, hiding from view gray pipes from which still rose barely visible steam. Archives filled with new folders whose spines marked with codes understandable only to narrow circle of initiates. Inside lay reports where words danger and evacuation replaced with scheduled activities and process optimization. Bureaucracy transformed tragedy into statistics, and statistics into safe graphs, raising no questions from inspectors. Every stamp became seal of silence, approving order where only silence after explosion reigned. Men on rooftops changed positions, passing shovels to each other, without words, only nods confirming shift change. Their movements grew slower, but did not lose precision honed by years working in extreme conditions. Rubber coats rustled, reminding of surgeons saving lives, but here were no patients, only destruction requiring containment. Air thickened, making breathing difficult, yet no one removed protection, knowing this would be final gesture before inevitable. Holiday column formed at main gates, checking row neatness and clothing cleanliness. Organizers distributed instructions reminding about importance of smiles and step synchronicity, creating unity image. Music thundered louder, filling space with sounds, leaving no room for silence where doubts are born. People walked not looking back, because backward glance might reveal what they were not ready to accept. In offices, speeches already prepared, praising labor feats and devotion to cause, hiding true price paid for energy. Text edited, removing risk mentions, replacing them with phrases about reliability and stability. Microphones checked, so voice sounded confident, without tremor, capable of revealing inner tension. Every syllable carefully selected, transforming words into shield, protecting from questions already brewing in observers' minds. Contrast between top and bottom became physically palpable, as if invisible wall separated two worlds existing in parallel. Above smelled of burnt material, and metal below of perfumes and fresh baking displayed in shop windows for holiday. Above reigned silence, broken only by shovel creaks below, crowd hum merging in a single organism demanding spectacle. Division ran not along geographic lines, but along boundaries of knowledge and ignorance accepted as blessing. Machine worked grinding truth into convenient formulations and formulations into instructions distributed across instances. Each level added its share of control, cutting off excess and leaving only what matched a proof scenario. People obeyed, not because they believed, but because resistance required resources lacking in reserve. Fear of change proved stronger than desire to know truth, even if that truth could save lives. Shovel struck one final time, removing last debris, before shift received command to descend. Movement slowed, hands lowered, but eyes still long watched destroyed, dome memorizing every detail. Below music reached climax, orchestras played, final chords met with applause sounding like thunder rolls. Two worlds existed simultaneously, not intersecting, but inseparably linked by invisible consequence threads yet to be unwound. Descent down staircases felt like journey into past, where each step distance from contamination zone, but approached reality already changed forever. Faces remained tense, and eyes empty, reflecting inner void impossible to fill with rest. Below they met, silently nodding and averting gazes, understanding words here powerless. Silence between them became agreement sealed by shared knowledge that celebration was merely mask hiding scar. Archives locked closing originals in safes whose codes known only to few. Paper yellowed, ink faded, but numbers remained, waiting for moment when truth would become impossible to conceal. City continued, living, breathing, working, not noticing how foundation of familiar world cracked under invisible pressure. History written not with ink, but with silence, and silence, as known, weighs heavier than any words spoken aloud. Contrast did not disappear, merely dulled with time, transforming into background noise one could habituate to but never forget. Men dispersed to homes carrying burden impossible to share, only carry until end. Celebration concluded, banners rolled up, squares emptied, leaving behind only footprints and ribbon fragments. But in air still hung tension, reminding that catastrophe does not end with final chord, merely changes form. In the wards of endless corridors, bodies swelled beneath thin sheets while skin cracked and blackened, releasing a sickly sweet odor of decay and medical sulfur. The air grew thick and viscous, saturated with the vapors of decomposing tissue and harsh antiseptics that could no longer mask the true nature of the suffering. Daylight fell through windows onto white linens, instantly absorbing dark stains left by every restless shift. Silence here was deceptive, broken only by ragged breathing and the quiet groan of bed springs bearing the weight of fading lives. Each footstep on linoleum echoed like a reminder of what could no longer be stopped. Doctors watched helplessly as blood seeped from swollen gums and eyes lost their luster, turning into dull glass behind which life slowly extinguished. Their hands, trained for precision and control, now trembled over medical charts, recording symptoms that defied every known textbook. For bags chimed softly, counting down final hours, yet the fluid inside seemed useless against an invisible poison eating organs from within. Nurses changed dressings, deliberately avoiding the exposed flesh covered in crimson ulcers that resembled burns from an internal fire. Their faces remained stone masks, hiding profound despair and the crushing weight of their own powerlessness. In the basements of scientific institutes, dosimetrists meticulously rewrote logs, erasing real numbers with soft pencils and inscribing safe values in black ink. Flickering lamps cast long shadows across walls lined with metal cabinets and dusty archive boxes. Hands moved mechanically, drawing line after line, each stroke becoming another brick in a wall of denial. Paper rustled as it accepted falsehood as truth, while ink blots spread across the surface like open wounds that could never be healed. The air carried the scent of old dust and office paste, mixing with the heavy sediment of guilt settling deep in their lungs. Fear of official wrath proved stronger than terror of the invisible fire, and workers silently sealed envelopes knowing these pages would one day become death warrants. Rubber stamps struck sealing wax with dull thuds, binding documents whose contents directly contradicted reality. Hallways echoed no debates or protests, only the quiet scratch of pens and the shuffling of papers folding into faceless folders. Every signed sheet carried away a fragment of truth, replacing it with a convenient phrase approved from above. Silence in these rooms felt heavier than lead, pressing down on shoulders and forcing eyes to drop with every passing step. Concrete walls held the whispered readings of instruments while above, heavy trucks already roared to deliver sand and lead, sealing away not just the reactor, but the memory of what had happened. Engines tore through the morning quiet, wheels crushing asphalt and leaving deep ruts filled with mud and oil. Cranes hoisted massive slabs whose shadows swallowed the earth like giant hands, erasing all traces. Workers in dusty coveralls moved in rhythm with shouted commands, never questioning what lay hidden beneath layers of metal and cement. Every hammer strike against wooden formwork sounded like a funeral bell, marking the countdown to oblivion. New stretchers continued arriving at hospitals, their wheels scraping across floors and leaving trails of dust and hurried footprints. Patients lay motionless, their breathing growing increasingly shallow while skin took on an ashen gray hue reminiscent of post-fire cinders. Doctors flipped through protocol pages, documenting changes that medicine could not explain but was forced to ignore. Corners of wards accumulated heavy silence, broken only by quiet coughing and the creak of beds whose springs groaned under fading lives. Windows remained shut tight, though fresh air would bring no relief, only deepening the suffocating sense of isolation. Technicians in underground labs sorted samples into glass flasks whose walls instantly clouded with residue. Monitoring equipment hummed, registering radiation levels high enough to melt steel, yet readings were promptly wiped away with damp cloths. Pencils crumbled, leaving gray streaks on paper that were carefully painted over with black ink. Every corrected graph became an act of quiet rebellion against conscience, crushed beneath the weight of expected compliance. Ventilation systems droned, carrying paper dust and ink particles into dark shafts where they dissolved into nothingness, leaving only empty space behind. At the construction site, a sarcophagus rose against the pale sky, its outlines resembling a colossal grave. Cement mixers churned sand, gravel, and water into a uniform slurry pumped along steel chutes to upper tiers. Workers in respirators and heavy gloves guided the flow, ensuring not a single crack or gap remained. Dust settled on helmets and shoulders, forming a permanent gray film that could not be brushed away. Every poured section became another layer of forgetting, separating past from future behind an impenetrable barrier. Archive shelves bowed under the weight of folders whose spines bore codes understood only by a select few. Inside lay reports where words like danger and evacuation were replaced with scheduled maintenance and process optimization. Bureaucracy transformed tragedy into statistics, and statistics into harmless graphs that raised no questions from inspectors. Every official stamp became a seal of silence, affirming order where only post-blast quiet truly existed. Ink dried into paper fibers, crafting a narrative convenient for morning broadcasts and camera crews. Inside wards, nurses replaced linens, carefully avoiding the sight of patients whose fingers had already lost all sensation. Skin blistered and burst at the slightest touch, leaving wet marks and a cloying scent of decomposition. For drips ticked steadily, counting away moments, but the fluid running through tubes could not halt processes triggered by invisible particles. Doctors recorded observations, knowing these notes would never leave the building, yielding instead to official bulletins claiming stable conditions. Walls absorbed moans without emitting a sound, locking secrets within concrete blocks. Dosimetrists in subterranean labs continued their work, hands moving in a rhythm refined by years of routine measurements and corrections. Graphs were drawn on grid paper, but lines were carefully smoothed to conceal spikes that would trigger panic. Pencils sharpened yet crumbled, leaving marks on paper resembling cracks in parched earth, swiftly covered in dark ink. Every crossed-out line became a small offering placed on the altar of manufactured calm, a calm that no longer existed in reality. Room air remained stale, thick with the smell of aging paper and humming electrical insulation. Above the sarcophagus, cranes hoisted lead plates whose weight forced steel cables to strain toward their breaking point. The screech of grinding metal cut through engine roars and coordinators barking orders. Workers guided heavy loads, ensuring each piece settled precisely into place, forging an impenetrable shield. Dust rose in thick columns, coating protective goggles and seeping into glove seams, yet movements never slowed. Every installed block brought the reactor one step closer to disappearing from sight, transforming it into a silent legend. In archive rooms, invisible labor continued as original measurement records vanished in a furnace flames or dissolved in chemical baths. Clerks rewrote figures, adjusting them to match safety standards established decades earlier when such threats were unimaginable. Stamps pressed down with absolute certainty, codifying lies as law, while signatures secured documents that shielded those issuing commands from above. Every sheet became a brick in a wall of denial, behind which truth waited in the dark. Ink soaked into paper, manufacturing an illusion of order in a world long since unbalanced. Hospital corridors stretched like endless ribbons, their walls developing cracks that resembled veins on thinning skin. Lights flickered, casting fractured illumination over patients whose eyes no longer reflected the surrounding world. Nurses moved quietly, footsteps barely audible on rubber flooring soaked with chlorine and decay. For stands chimed, marking final hours, yet no one could stop time frozen in the space between life and fading. Air grew thicker, making each breath a struggle, but windows stayed sealed, preserving the illusion of control over the uncontrollable. Lab workers sorted samples into metal containers whose lids snapped shut with dull clicks. Instruments registered radiation levels capable of rewriting genetic code, yet readings were manually adjusted on the spot. Pencils left gray trails across paper that were promptly painted over, hiding true contamination scales. Every altered report became an act of quiet compliance with a system demanding calm at any cost. Ventilation units hummed, carrying dust and ink particles into dark ventilation shafts where they dissolved without a trace. On the construction grounds, a monument to oblivion took shape, its silhouette cutting against a gray sky like a massive coffin. Cement mixers rotated, grinding raw materials into uniform paste delivered to upper levels through steel channels. Workers in heavy protective gear directed the flow, ensuring not a single fissure or opening remained. Dust settled on helmets and shoulders, creating a permanent gray layer that water could not wash away. Every poured section added another layer of silence, sealing past from future behind an unyielding wall. In institute basements, work intensified to craft a version of history suitable for future generations. Documents sorted by color separated alarming reports from approved directives. Inkwells dried out, yet ink still left traces on paper, forming a narrative that diverged sharply from reality. Safes stored original measurements, but access was blocked by heavy iron grates and combination locks. Every page stood as testimony to a silent conspiracy, where truth was sacrificed to systemic stability. Walls absorbed whispers, but gave back nothing. Wards filled with stillness, broken only by shallow breathing and the groan of bed springs bearing fading weight. Doctors rewrote diagnoses, replacing clinical terms with vague phrasing that raised no eyebrows. For drips continued ticking, but the fluid and tubing could no longer alter events set in motion by invisible force. Nurses changed bandages, avoiding exposed skin marked by crimson patches resembling burns from within. Their expressions remained rigid masks, concealing profound despair and the heavy realization of their own helplessness. Dosimetrists pressed on, hands moving in rhythm honed by years of routine measurement and deliberate alteration. Graphs plotted on millimeter paper, but lines carefully smoothed to erase panic-inducing peaks. Pencils crumbled under pressure, leaving crack-like marks swiftly covered in dark ink. Every crossed-out entry became a quiet sacrifice offered to the altar of enforced calm, a calm already shattered in reality. Room air stayed heavy, saturated with the scent of aged paper and humming wire insulation. At the sarcophagus site, cranes lifted final slabs, their weight pushing steel cables to absolute limits. Metal grinding against metal pierced through engine noise and short radio commands. Workers guided heavy loads, ensuring perfect alignment to forge an unbreakable barrier. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating goggles and working into glove seams, yet pace never faltered. Every placed block brought the reactor one step closer to vanishing from view, turning it into a quiet monument to denial. Heavy vault doors closed in archives, hiding original records in darkness known only to a handful. Paper yellowed, ink faded, yet numbers remained, waiting for the moment truth could no longer be buried. The city kept living, breathing, working, unaware how the foundation of familiar reality cracked under invisible pressure. History written not in ink, but in silence, and silence, as always, weighs heavier than any spoken word. The contrast did not vanish, merely dulled over time, becoming background noise one could learn to endure but never forget. Finally, sirens wailed, tearing through the silence of sleeping neighborhoods with a sharp, unnatural shriek that made window panes rattle in old frames and woke residents on upper floors. Loudspeakers at intersections broadcast dry commands demanding immediate assembly at building entrances, yet the announcers' voices already carried hidden panic impossible to mask with official tone. Streets instantly came alive, transforming into chaotic streams of figures hastily gathering in clusters beneath entryway canopies that loomed overhead like giant bird wings. The air filled with the scent of alarm, mixed with remnants of morning coffee and cold dust that had seemed harmless just yesterday, but now carried an invisible burden. Heavy buses crawled onto asphalt, forming a long winding serpent whose headlights cut through morning fog with yellow beams, casting trembling shadows on walls. Doors opened with the dull hiss of pneumatics, admitting people clutching worn bags and cardboard boxes tied with laundry rope. No one asked unnecessary questions because answers were already written on soldiers' faces as they cordoned off neighborhoods with rifles and silently pointed the way. Each step toward metal stairs measured not distance, but final severance from familiar life that could never be returned. People grabbed only the most essential items, frantically stuffing documents, medicine, and children's toys into sacks, while leaving half-finished cups of tea and open books on kitchen tables, their pages still bearing fingerprints. Keys turned in locks with heavy clicks, as if cutting off the past with an invisible blade, forever closing doors on an era that would never repeat. Hallways retained photographs in worn frames, letters tied with faded ribbons, and floorboards holding echoes of childhood footsteps and creaks of beloved armchairs. Doors closed permanently, transforming apartments into sealed time capsules where the final minute of peaceful existence froze in place. Inside vehicles, oppressive silence reigned, broken only by infants' quiet crying and the creak of leather seats beneath weary bodies whose shoulders sagged under the weight of incomprehension. Adults stared through fogged windows, watching familiar store signs, playgrounds, and school fences drift past, places that would never again be home. Drivers shifted gears silently, avoiding eye contact with passengers in rearview mirrors because eyes reflected an abyss toward which they traveled. Wheels whispered against wet asphalt, carrying thousands of fates into uncertainty left without explanation or promise of return. Above the zone, a concrete sarcophagus rose, massive and faceless, its outlines growing hourly as it absorbed reactor debris and the crushing silence of destruction like a colossal grave for a living heart. Cranes hoisted heavy slabs whose shadows swallowed the earth, erasing catastrophe traces and replacing them with artificial mountain geometry. Workers in lead aprons and respirators moved in rhythms of desperation, pouring cracks with thick slurry meant to become an eternal prison for invisible fire, consuming everything in its path. Every poured section brought closer the moment of complete oblivion when error would be buried beneath layers of stone. The structure transformed into a monument of human sacrifice and state deception, its walls concealing not only radioactive core, but hundreds of truthful reports whose contents could overturn the world. Concrete absorbed instrument whispers and controllers' final commands, sealing them forever in cold mass, rendering them mute witnesses to tragedy. Engineers inspected, seems knowing any crack would become a leakage path, yet haste forced eyes closed over microscopic defects, hoping time would forgive negligence. The sarcophagus grew like an artificial burial mound, designed to inter mistakes beneath stone and steel. Nature slowly began reclaiming its territory, sprouting through asphalt cracks and prying apart curbs with powerful roots whose strength exceeded human calculations. Wild grasses pushed through sidewalk tiles, painting streets in unnaturally vivid green that contrasted with gray abandoned buildings and rusted cornices. Wind carried seeds, scattering them across empty courtyards where laughter once rang, and now only leaf rustles and branch creaks echoed. Life knew no boundaries humans imposed, continuing its advance, ignoring invisible barriers and prohibitions. Animals wandered through empty squares, cautiously sniffing abandoned belongings and peering into open entryways, unaware of poison that had accumulated in soil for centuries and seeped into groundwater. Foxes crept past rusted swings, birds nested in shattered balconies, and deer stepped onto roadways, feeling like rightful masters of territory cleansed of human noise. Their eyes reflected the calm of creatures whose survival instinct proved stronger than human anxieties and political games. They drank from puddles, unsuspecting that water held decay traces, altering genetics of future generations. The city transformed into an open-air museum where every stone bore imprints of others' pain, and rusted signs reminded of suddenly interrupted routines whose rhythm would never repeat. Store windows gathered dust. Inside lay goods whose expiration dates long passed, yet no one hurried to claim them, leaving price tags as final testimonies of commerce. Wall calendars stopped on April dates, and in kitchens, sink basins held dried food remnants turned to black stains reminding of departed meals. Time froze here, refusing to move forward without its witnesses, leaving only echoes of footsteps in empty corridors. Wind scattered forgotten document fragments through forests, swirling them in air like autumn leaves before pressing them to damp earth, where paper began slowly decomposing. Ink bled, erasing names and titles, transforming official reports into formless stains whose meaning dissolved without signatures and stamps. Archive folders rotted in basements while fungus slowly consumed figures once deemed too dangerous for disclosure, now becoming nourishment for mold. Nature erased traces of human presence, returning everything to primal chaos where truth held no significance. Streets overgrew with shrubs whose branches pushed through broken windows, weaving around furniture and carpets, transforming interiors into green caves where sunlight penetrated only in narrow beams. Rains washed paint from facades, exposing brick whose mortar had long cracked from temperature swings and hidden vibrations weakening structures. Sidewalks heaved, forming uneven mounds where parades once marched, and now only wild animal tracks left impressions in mud mixed with ash. The city died not instantly but slowly, surrendering each meter of earth back to forest that felt no hurry yet remained inevitable. Official maps were redrawn, erasing village and factory names, replacing them with faceless exclusion zone designations whose boundaries were drawn by invisible sensor hands. Topographic symbols vanished from atlases while roads overgrew with grass, becoming trails traversed only by stalkers and foresters whose maps were hand-drawn. Authorities attempted to erase memory, yet concrete building skeletons stood like tombstones, reminding that what already occurred and scarred the Earth's face cannot be destroyed. Every empty neighborhood became a silent rebuke to systems preferring silence over truth. In schools, chalk formulas remained on blackboards, their letters faded by dampness, while initials carved into desks merged with mold, concealing names of those who once sat there. Globes stood in corners, dust-covered, pointing to countries whose borders no longer mattered to those remaining beyond the perimeter, severed from the world by barbed wire. Gymnasiums emptied, leaving behind only the scent of old varnish and worn mats where children once jumped, their voices carried away by wind. Education halted, yielding to survival and oblivion where lessons were taught by silence and time itself. Hospital corridors gathered condensation films, concealing traces of past haste and desperation when doctors rushed between wards trying to stop the irreversible. Beds rusted while 4 stands stood empty, reminding of battles lost before treatment began, whose instruments no longer held power against invisible enemies. Medical records crumbled from moisture, revealing diagnoses never spoken aloud, remaining secrets between walls and falsified reports. The scent of medicines faded, yielding to damp plaster and mildewed paper holding final hopes for salvation. Radioactive particles settled on rooftops, penetrated soil, absorbed into tree roots, creating invisible networks connecting earth to sky and transmitting poison through food chains. Dosimeters fell silent because they were taken with evacuees. Yet Earth continued emitting heat invisible to eyes, but detectable by instruments whose readings were hidden in safes. Geological layers preserved catastrophe memory, sealing isotopes in clay and sand where they would lie for millennia, awaiting new generations. Nature adapted, mutated, learned to live under new rules written by human error and pride. Wind wandered empty streets, lifting dust and making rusted entry doors creak, long forgotten by human palms whose touches remained only on dusty handles. Streetlights stayed unlit, leaving neighborhoods in perpetual twilight where shadows grew longer and denser with each sunset, swallowing building contours. Leaves rustled, creating illusions of footsteps, while branches tapped against glass as if trying to wake sleeping residents whose apartments long became bird nests. The city breathed, but its breath was heavy, saturated with ozone and memories of voices that would never return. Archive safes remained locked, their mechanisms rusting from moisture, concealing inside reports capable of altering historical understanding and revealing the price paid for illusions of safety. Ink on paper faded, yet numbers remained, awaiting the moment when truth would become impossible to conceal and concrete would begin crumbling under time's pressure. Scientists in other cities conducted measurements, comparing data, yet their findings were silenced under pretext of maintaining calm so as not to disturb fragile trust balances. Each new year brought closer the moment when Earth would rise, releasing what had been carefully buried for calm purchased at silence's price. Nature felt no hurry, its time measured in seasons and generations, not minutes and hours whose hands stopped on clocks in abandoned apartments. Trees strengthened roots in soil, processing heavy metals, while fungi absorbed radiation, converting it to growth energy, defying biological laws. Forests advanced slowly yet inevitably, consuming asphalt, brick, and metal, returning territory to its original state where humans were merely guests. People departed, leaving behind only traces of their presence that rain and wind erased with the same relentlessness with which they concealed truth. Every cobblestone held imprints of others' pain, absorbing vibrations of footsteps that once hurried to work, school, home, unsuspecting of invisible threat looming over the city. Now those footsteps echoed only in empty courtyard reverberations, reflecting off walls whose plaster fell in large flakes, exposing rebar whose steel rusted from within. Wind caught newspaper fragments, swirling them in air until they fell into puddles, dissolving in murky water, holding past traces that refused to die completely. The city became a monument whose name vanished from maps, yet whose shadow fell upon history forever. And still, despite silence and desolation, Earth continued breathing, emitting invisible heat, reminding that catastrophe does not end with the last evacuation bus, but merely transitions into a phase of slow smoldering. The sarcophagus stood on the horizon, dark and silent, holding within it a reactor whose heart still beat beneath layers of concrete and steel, whose protection would thin with time. Truth did not vanish. It merely sank deeper, sprouting roots through cracks, awaiting the day when someone would again lift a manhole cover and see what had been carefully hidden for calm purchased at silence's price. Decades later, in a forgotten archive, a cracked safe was pried open, its metal doors groaning as they yielded, releasing stale air and a cloud of fine dust. Inside lay yellowed sheets of calculations, their ink faded, but the numbers still sharp and unforgiving, as if burned directly into the paper. Researchers' hands trembled as they turned the pages, finding not records of technical failure or negligence, but cold, calculated graphs of controlled destruction. Every equation proved the explosion was no accident. It was a meticulously planned experiment designed to test the absolute limits of human survival under extreme conditions. The documents carried the scent of aged leather and chemical preservatives, echoing the closed-door offices where decisions were made that would ripple through thousands of lives. Names of scientists and party officials sat beside columns of approved radiation doses, figures that dwarfed safe limits yet were stamped without a single risk warning. Signatures were applied with steady hands, seals pressed into wax with such force that the paper tore at the edges, leaving behind marks of absolute authority and unshakable impunity. These lines did more than debunk the official story. They exposed a machinery where human lives were reduced to expendable variables and ambitions recorded in sterile protocol. Beneath the concrete shell, the reactor did not die. It slipped into a dormant state, invisible to standard sensors hidden behind an artificial mountain. Fuel rods continued their slow decay, leaking heat that seeped into groundwater, transforming it into an invisible, boiling cauldron of energy. Perimeter instruments recorded only background noise, while deep monitoring wells registered anomalous temperatures, data that was immediately classified under the highest security clearance. The Earth breathed in a heavy, uneven rhythm, like a heart beating under anesthesia, still pumping poisoned blood long after the body was declared gone. Those who read these lines in the dim light of archive basements understood that the cities were buried not to protect future generations, but to preserve a mechanism that demanded absolute isolation. The evacuation was never an act of mercy. It was a surgical removal of witnesses whose questions might have shattered a carefully engineered architecture of silence. Buses carried people away, while engineers in lead suits injected specialized compounds into cracks, building a barrier not against radiation, but against the curiosity of those yet to come. Every liter of concrete settled like a seal of silence, hiding not a disaster, but a deliberate choice made by those at the helm. The machine, born in laboratory depths, was never meant for destruction. It only required sleep and observation, its parameters transmitted over encrypted channels. Operators kept watch in underground bunkers, cross-referencing readings with charts approved decades earlier, back when the world had never heard the words exclusion zone. Their faces remained pale, eyes weary from the constant flicker of monitors whose lines traced decay, curves stretching into infinity. They were not saviors. They had become keepers of a secret, whose price was measured not in currency, but in decades of silence and buried conscience. Today, grass once again sways over the ruins, its green stems reaching for the sky, indifferent to the invisible fields that saturate the soil from horizon to horizon. Wind bends the tall stalks, creating waves that mimic the breathing of a sleeping giant, its body cloaked in moss and rusted metal. Birds nest in shattered balconies, while foxes carve paths through overgrown courtyards, unaware their paws tread on earth holding the imprints of human mistakes. Nature reclaims the space, yet beneath the thin layer of turf, energy continues to pulse, a rhythm no rain or passage of time can silence. The ground beneath the grass trembles with a muffled rhythm, transmitting vibrations through concrete slabs and rusted rebar that jut from the soil like skeletal ribs. Seismographs hidden in nearby forests record microtremors, their graphs resembling the cardiogram of a coma patient. Not dead, only dormant. Scientists cross-reference data, knowing official reports label it residual thermal background, while actual measurements point to ongoing reactions. Every pulse serves as a reminder that sealed doors do not mark the end of a story. They merely postpone the reckoning indefinitely. Truth does not die. It only lies in wait, like a seed sleeping in frozen soil, its awakening inevitable with the coming of spring. Archive safes corrode, but the documents within retain their weight, their contents capable of appending entrenched narratives of heroism and accident. Those who guard copies know that silence becomes a crushing burden, pressing on shoulders heavier than any lead apron, yet it is too late to vote against the system. They pass folders from hand to hand like a relay baton, knowing that one day the concrete will crack and release everything that was buried. The concrete sarcophagus stands on the horizon, dark and silent, its walls laced with a network of fine fractures widening with each cycle of rain and frost. Engineers inspect the surface, noting fresh chips and faded patches, their defects logged in reports but triggering no immediate action. Time works against the structure, corroding joints and weakening foundations whose pilings sink into soil saturated with isotopes and groundwater. Each year brings closer the moment when the artificial mountain will fail under internal pressure, exposing what has been hidden from the world for decades. Groundwater continues its slow migration, seeping through cracks in the reactor hull, where temperatures remain anomalously high even in the deepest winters. Steam rises from invisible fissures, condensing on cold surfaces and forming steady drips whose rhythmic tapping echoes through empty corridors. Sensors analyze chemical composition, revealing impurities whose origins defy natural explanation, yet the results remain locked in classified databases. Water becomes a carrier of information, its decryption requiring courage strong enough to resist the inertia of official narratives and convenient forgetting. Those who once made the decisions are long gone, leaving behind only signatures on yellowed paper and shadows in the halls of power, whose walls still remember their footsteps. Yet the system continues to run on inertia, generating new reports that recycle old falsehoods, manufacturing an illusion of control. Archives fill with folders whose spines bear codes understandable only to the initiated, while actual measurements are fed into incinerators. The cycle repeats because acknowledging truth means admitting guilt, and guilt has no place in ceremonial speeches or commemorative dates. Wind scatters fragments of forgotten instructions across the forest, their pages settling onto moss and rotting leaves, dissolving into the soil alongside ink and official stamps. Rains wash dust from signs, revealing faded letters whose meaning is remembered only by those who guard copies in hidden vaults. Nature erases traces, but does not destroy essence, whose energy continues to circulate through the earth, passing from layer to layer, from stone to root. Each season brings change, yet the foundation remains untouched, waiting for the moment human curiosity outweighs the fear of retribution. Researchers return to the perimeter, carrying instruments whose screens flicker in the dusk, capturing deviations that refuse to fit within approved parameters. They log data into notebooks, knowing these pages could trigger interrogations, yet they continue recording reality without embellishment. Their boots crunch over gravel, leaving footprints tomorrow's rain will wash away, but the numbers in their journals will remain, a quiet protest against oblivion. Every measurement becomes an act of resistance, whose value lies not in recognition, but in preserving memory for those who will come after. The reactor continues to breathe in its dormant state, its existence impossible to deny, just as one cannot deny gravity or the passage of time. It demands no attention. It simply is, holding its place in a space where human ambition collided with physical limits and lost. Concrete cracks, metal rusts, and the earth remembers every step, every order, every silent compliance of those who knew but said nothing. History does not end on textbook pages. It continues in underground halls, where silence speaks louder than words, and truth waits for its moment. Someday, the concrete will split open, releasing everything buried alongside conscience, fear, and convenient lies. Rain will widen the cracks, tree roots will breach the foundation, and instruments will capture pulses whose graphs will finally match the archive calculations locked in safes. The world will see not just ruins, but a monument to human hubris, whose consequences are measured not in years, but in generations whose DNA carries the imprints of the past. But as long as grass sways in the wind and the earth trembles with a muffled rhythm, truth remains alive, reminding us that no wall can hold back what is already broken free.